Hello, I'd like to welcome everyone to the PartsSource Executive Webinar Series. As we are all carefully navigating the COVID-19 pandemic and related challenges arising in this time of heightened concern for human health and patient safety, serving our customers remains PartsSource's highest priority. In support of all of our HTM customers working to keep mission-critical equipment operational for patient care, to help provide guidance, and an opportunity for knowledge sharing, we are offering today's presentation, 5 clinical engineering preparedness strategies for uptime with COVID-19, presented by PartsSource executives Dave Brennan, Senior Vice President and Chief Product Officer, and Mara Poirier, Vice President of Client Solutions and Account Management. Before I begin, I'd like to review a few housekeeping items. First, you have a control panel at the top or side of your screen. You can minimize and control this panel. Second, you can submit questions using the question portion of the control panel. We will try to answer as many questions as we can at the end of the presentation. If your question is not answered, we will respond to you individually after the event. And last, all registrants will receive a link to the recorded presentation after the webinar. This follow-up information will be sent to the email address with which you registered for this webinar. Now on to our overview. So today we're going to be talking again about the top 5 clinical engineering preparedness strategies for uptime with COVID-19. As our valued customers are carefully navigating the COVID-19 pandemic and the related issues arising in this time of heightened concern for human health and patient safety, serving our customers, as I mentioned before, remains our highest priority. During this session, our presenters will review the challenges currently faced in the market and how some are addressing the current issues. We will identify what strategies and insights can be used to help manage or prepare for the COVID-19 crisis, and we will discuss supplier relationships and partners that can be used together, also how they are serving the supply chain. Allow me now to introduce to you today's speakers, Mara Poirier and Dave Brennan. Dave Brennan joined PartsSource's executive leadership team in 2018. He now serves as Senior Vice President and Chief Product Officer. After nearly 20 years with GE Healthcare, most recently leading the global on-demand parts and services e-commerce business, Brennan held executive roles in various divisions, led the growth and market expansion of aftermarket parts and services, and was responsible for product management and global profitability of support services. Here at PartsSource, Brennan leads our expanding portfolio of clinical resource management services available to all PartsSource customers. As Vice President of Client Solutions at PartsSource, Mara Poirier works closely with leaders in clinical engineering and HTM to design and implement data-driven programs that transform procurement through evidence-based decisions to improve efficiency, cost, and quality. After spending 10 years in the HTM industry, most recently with Allina Health, Mara understands how to build in-house HTM programs, streamline and consolidate purchasing and vendor management, and execute on service strategy that not only contributes positively to an organization's bottom line, but ensures a safe and timely medical equipment experience for patients. Welcome, Dave and Mara. Mara, I give you the floor.
Thank you, Colleen. Good afternoon, everyone. Happy to be with you here this afternoon. Today, we're going to be talking about top 5 clinical engineering preparedness strategies for uptime. We're going to start with knowing where to start. We're going to discuss some short-term needs that we see happening in the clinical engineering community, how you and your organization can start predicting demand based on the pandemic needs that are happening, what type of collaboration you should be looking at forming with both your supply chain as well as your external supply chain, and how we can all start preparing for a new future. So as we jump in, I just want to take a minute and recognize that we're living in a truly amazing moment in modern history. Everyone we know is being impacted by this pandemic, and we in healthcare particularly are at a critical juncture. As schools close, as restaurants and childcare facilities close, millions of Americans are beginning to work from home, and millions more are having to file for unemployment. And this is a moment where healthcare in general, but HCM in specific, can really be a guiding light on how to see a path forward through this pandemic. As you start to think about where you are along the demand curve of what's happening right now, it's important to note that we still have areas that are not significantly impacted, that this is in some aspects a lull before the storm for some of us. And for those that aren't significantly impacted, it's important to understand where we are on the curve of demand. It's also very important to not wait. A critical piece of advice is to begin to gather key stakeholders and act now. Make sure that you have a cross-functional group in your organization comprised of clinicians, IT and technology support, your supply chain group, HTM, facilities, among many other critical elements of your organization to start to plan for success as you navigate these waters. As we're looking and talking with our customers on a daily basis, we're noticing that top decile leaders in the HTM community are really assessing three critical areas right now. And these three critical areas are comprised of asset inventory, staffing, and supply chain and disinfection and sterilization. So I just want to take a minute and talk briefly about asset inventory. As organizations are navigating this crisis, they're taking stock of their asset inventory. They're ensuring that they have accurate counts in their CMMS systems of their assets, that locations of their equipment have been updated so that they know exactly what they have and where it is. And they're also looking at the potential redeployment of that equipment, the repurposing of certain types of equipment, and bringing units out of storage and making them patient ready in preparation for increased patient loads. Many organizations are looking at this in the context of their primary facilities. They're looking at potential off-site triage locations, secondary locations where they can add additional bed space. They're looking at canceling or have already canceled elective procedures. And many customers we're talking with are getting creative about the conversion of space into ICU units for use during the COVID-19 pandemic. They're looking at converting psychiatric spaces or spaces into ICUs to create surge capacity. And some organizations are even opening new wings and buildings earlier than they had planned in order to have additional bed space. The types of equipment that are really critical on the list for our customers right now are obviously ventilators, infusion, patient monitoring, and beds. But they're also starting to look at what they will need in terms of PM kits for preventive maintenance to get equipment back up and running that's been in storage, O2 sensors, pulse oximeters, batteries, and sterilization and disinfection equipment. So with that, I want to hand it over to Dave to talk briefly about staffing and supply chain needs.
Thanks, Mara. Before I start, I just want to give a shout out to everybody out there. A big thank you. I know the critical work that you are doing is protecting our families, our colleagues across the country, and we couldn't be more appreciative. So as Mara said, as we talk to our customers, we are seeing the top folks do really top to bottom staffing assessments, and they are looking at skill sets, forming new work groups, and determining how to create distance across these teams. Specifically what they're doing, and I would encourage you to do, is to look at your teams and begin to stratify your on-site technicians. Think about and identify by name who's cross-trained on what, who are your go-to folks that are sort of jack of all trades. We've all seen them in every organization, and begin to, if you haven't already, identify sort of who is the primary, who's the secondary, per category, per modality, per specialty. And then of course, for each of those, identify backups. The reason to do this is because then what we're seeing is people are then creating various work groups. They're creating a separation of all these key players into redundant, intentionally redundant and overlapping teams so that they can form coverage plans to cover their facilities in an attempt to assume and predict that some of their staff will inevitably become infected, and you're going to need to call in teams A, B, and C kind of respectively and be able to rotate people out. And that brings me to the third point, which is creating distance with these teams. The idea is to really identify these critical folks, segment them such that they're not in the same place at the same time. They're not working on the same problem together. And that you're able to rotate these groups. We're also seeing that about 20% of larger HTM teams are being able to be sent home right now and begin working remotely immediately. The idea is for anybody who's not in one of these on-site groups to be on call and have clear response times and expectations set up about how they would, man their phones, if you will, and stay ready. And that all teams, on-site or off, are beginning to implement health checks. So the most frequent one that we've heard of is taking your temperature twice a day, logging it, and submitting it to a central repository, if you will. We also see people doing top to bottom supply chain reviews, and we're going to talk a lot about this in the slides to come. So I won't go into great detail here, but now is the time. Depending on where you are in the country, if you're in the thick of this already or you're waiting for it to surge in your area, now is the time to take measures to start assuring you have adequate coverage of your equipment, your parts, but more importantly, the secondary things like rentals, service support, your supply team that's supporting you, whether those are contractors that come by infrequently or are in your shop every day, making sure you've got a full inventory of all those folks and are reaching out proactively with them to set expectations during this time. Then that brings me to parts, accessories, supplies. It's a really critical, and we'll talk a little bit more about it in the slides to come, to assess these parts and make sure you're looking at your historical consumption and keep an open mind that what you've purchased in the past may not be what you purchase in the future. Meaning if you have OEM preferences, you may need to look at secondary sources and look for people who have bulk purchasing power to help you. So that brings us to our next topic. If we could move to the next slide, please.
Thanks, Dave. So I think what's on top of mind for a lot of people right now are, how can I anticipate what I'm going to be needing, what my patients are going to be needing, what my organization is going to be needing, and how do I plan ahead? And the key areas that we're really hearing from customers where they're putting a lot of focus and planning on is the following. Obviously, PPE is top of mind for everyone. And as everyone knows, access is a big challenge right now. Access in the market, both nationally, on a state level, and locally. And there's a lot of allocation efforts going on right now at all of those different levels. And we hear from our suppliers that there's a large ramp up in production for N95 masks and other forms of PPE. We've seen a great groundswell, obviously, in our local communities for mobilization for sewing masks and bringing them to our healthcare providers at hospitals. It's been really heartening to see communities rising up to protect their healthcare workers. As many of you probably know, Joint Commission recently approved bringing face masks and respirators from home to areas where we don't have enough coverage. And some of our customers and organizations are finding creative ways for clinicians to also get remote access to patients in their rooms. And this allows them to cut down on PPE use, only use it when absolutely necessary to go into the room, and also cut down on the amount of exposure that they have to infected patients. One example of a customer of ours is using mobile video tablet kiosks that they've set up in patient rooms and outside that room for clinicians and doctors to be able to do check-ins with patients and not have the exposure to the room. So definitely we're seeing customers get creative and use technology in really creative ways. So, you know, I think also we've seen the FDA just recently approved ASP sterilizers for sterilizing N95 masks. So a lot of organizations are starting to put plans in place to be able to reuse N95 masks after they've been sterilized properly per the FDA guidelines. So while access is still a challenge, people are getting creative with how they get access to and cut down on use of PPE while still keeping healthcare staff safe. I think, you know, the second place, which Dave just touched on, is staffing, that obviously HTM teams are giving a ton of thought, really thoughtful consideration to right now. And as they're thinking about moving their teams remote and dividing their teams into, you know, and stratifying them, as Dave mentioned, they're also starting to think about their external labor. Most HTM organizations use external labor in some form or fashion. So this is a really critical time to identify your supplier network that you do use. Take a look at where you have contractual obligations, service contracts, et cetera, where you have OEMs or third-party service providers that are contracted to do that work. And make sure that you're reaching out and validating their availability and really locking them in for those critical needs that your organization has, and ensuring that when you need to call on them, they are going to be there. I think the other area, obviously, with additional equipment, as we expand the critical areas, critical care areas in hospitals, is to make sure that HTM is involved in every element of planning that the organization is undergoing to expand these critical care areas. It really is timely to think about exactly what equipment and accessories you will need to outfit each and every critical care bed, creating that list and having a checklist for those areas is very important. As we know, it's extremely limited on the market right now in terms of additional ventilator equipment, but there is still quite a bit of infusion and patient monitoring equipment available. Patient monitoring equipment being very important for that distance monitoring that clinicians need to do for COVID-19 patients. And, you know, it's really timely also to think about who have you used for your supply chain in the past to be able to procure equipment. And to Dave's earlier point, get creative, start thinking about other sources potentially for equipment that you might have not used in the past if you've depended heavily on OEMs. Making sure you have redundancy in your supply chain and planning for that going forward is really, really critical.
The other thing is people have been calling us, actually the phone's sort of been ringing off the hook about how do I free up my capacity? What do I prioritize? What should I do first, second, third? And we've been having great conversations about what people can tackle in-house. And I would encourage you to, you know, sort of do some reflection about where your teams are best positioned. Should they be triaging issues and serving your clinicians, or should they be heads down on a bench, you know, fixing something? That blend of labor versus being there for your internal customers is what is on top of mind. And so folks, you know, that we've been talking to, we've been encouraging them to look at their depot strategy, look at their PM schedules, and look to those that can support them. I think many of you know that we have a service grid. We have over 400 field service engineers and access to help folks with really all of their modalities across the hospital, depending on where you are in the world. But it's not just us. People are reaching out to their ISO partners, reaching out to their OEM partners, and really building plans to shift work that they have traditionally done in their teams to external partners so that they can focus on more pressing tasks in their shops. I would say PMs is probably the biggest question, if out of all of those, looking at patient monitoring, infusion, ventilation as the top three. What are we doing? What should we be doing? And I don't know that there's one answer. I would say that most people who have already adopted an alternative equipment maintenance schedule have a leg up because they have a data-based and a data-driven approach to that. But as Jaco and others have mentioned, that they will be easing some of their traditional pursuits, if you will, people are pushing out other PMs. Now that means that we've got to also think about the second half of this year and what happens when the tsunami sort of washes through your area, and will it rebound? Will there be a second wave here? But I would encourage you to think about that and certainly reach out if you have questions about our depot capabilities, our PM capabilities, but certainly there are many, many others out there as well. The next area is really about surge planning within those key modalities. And on the right side of the page, there's a guide there, and it's okay. We can stay on this page for a second. There's a guide there that we put together that we looked at over 1,000 hospitals. We looked at the popular models that are being used in those hospitals. We looked at the top running parts for those machines, and we've been communicating with our customers about exactly what those are, and in particular what kind of quantities. And we'll show you a picture of this coming up in a few slides, so that you too can really up your demand planning game. That's something that we spend all of our time in and day out, doing supply and demand planning on your behalf and making sure that we are stocking appropriately. But we'll share this guide later tonight with all of you so that you have it. And we'll continue to use our analytics and use our intelligence to build this kind of guidance for the industry. If we go to the next slide, this is just a look at some of the analytics that we look at on a daily basis. And I think those of you that know us know that we pride ourselves on curating vast amounts of data so that we can make smart purchasing decisions on behalf of our customers, find the best products. And this is just one example of that. What you're looking at is, we decided to start looking regionally at spikes. And we won't spend a lot of time on this, but this is simply a graph of volume over the last 60 days in New York City versus other cities in the US, relative basis. And you can see the three areas that we've highlighted here around infusion, respiratory, and what we call general biomed, which has a lot of oxygen therapy and classic sort of support materials in the biomed space here. So the point here is we'd encourage you to know your regional dynamics, encourage you to start, if you haven't already, looking at your historical volumes, encourage you to start thinking about your consumption patterns. And of course, what we do is we leverage this to make smart bulk buys. We leverage this to make, put some stock into what we call our PartsSource Pro guaranteed stockpiles for our PartsSource Pro customers. And of course, we use this to reach out proactively to our supply base, first to those that we purchase from primarily, but then we look for secondary and tertiary options. We look for near alternatives in the marketplace. An example of that would be, thermometers. Thermometers, as everyone on the phone knows, have been flying off the shelf. Infrared, oral, rectal, every thermometer make you can imagine. But what people don't often look for is those alternatives who are maybe the second class product, where it doesn't return the patient's temperature within 1 second, but you have to wait 10 or 15 seconds. And those products are out there, and they're typically not given consideration. But in tough times like this, we find those and make those alternatives available. So just a little snippet. If we go to the next slide.
Sure. Yeah. So we wanted to share an example that we've put together and shared with our customer base on how you can look at your historical consumption and make some recommendations to you on how to start doing demand planning within your organization and figuring out what you should be keeping on hand during this critical time in terms of parts and equipment, and what you should be considering for putting on some type of reorder basis. When we started to look at these critical modalities, we wanted to look at ventilators and respiratory modality first. So we took our nationwide data from the over 3,000 hospitals that we currently service and provide service and parts for, and we did analysis on that historical consumption and tied it to the models of equipment that our customers have in their asset install base, and came up with the top models of respiratory and ventilation equipment, looked at what the top runners were for parts that were purchased to both maintain that equipment and repair it when corrective maintenance is needed. And from that, we were able to make recommendations for suggested quantities on hand for every 100 ventilator assets that your organization has. And really why we find this type of data so important to share with our customers is that it's extremely important to base your buying and purchasing decisions on data. I think we've all seen what panic buying can look like, a la what's going on in the world right now with the toilet paper run that's happening for all of us. And it can be similar in our industry and in the world that we live in. We want to encourage folks, including ourselves, to buy rationally and thoughtfully and really base it on the assets you have and what your needs are going to be. So this is data that we will share out with this group when we send the modality guide out, so that you'll have access to looking at this and being able to leverage it for your own organization. We also want to encourage everybody that since analytics does play such a key role in really being prepared and making sure that you are preparing your organization for this situation, that we know and we recognize that many HTM organizations out there don't necessarily have a team of analysts at standby to be able to do all of this for yourselves. So we encourage you to get creative and go beyond your own direct team, and really leverage some non-traditional analytic resources, whether that's in your supply chain group, whether you have friends and family that are great in Excel that can help you with data. Get creative, because it's very important to study your own historical consumption patterns. There's a lot of data in your CMMS, in your ERP. You can also leverage third parties, organizations like PartsSource. If you buy from us, we have your historical consumption patterns. We're very happy to work with you on the analytics specific to your organization and what you should be stocking. So feel free to reach out to us. But we really encourage everyone, regardless of where you purchase from, to make these type of data-driven decisions as you're considering what to put in your par levels and what to stock up on and be prepared for. The last thing I'll just say about this particular analysis we did for the ventilation modality is that we also really looked at what were going to be the high fail parts for equipment that's being run continuously for vents. So we did up the quantities for those and vetted this with some top respiratory technicians in the country, as well as with our OEM partners. So we feel pretty confident in our suggestions here. And the last thing I'll just mention on this topic is it's also important to consider secondary modalities. As we all know, X-ray and ultrasound are being used as diagnostic tools for chest scans. So making sure that you're not neglecting those modalities, but you're ensuring that that equipment is up and running and you have what you need to keep that equipment uptime as close to 100% as possible is really critical for the diagnostic tool piece. And then also we're seeing quite an uptick in sterilization and disinfection equipment and parts to keep those up and running. We're also seeing people look at more alternatives that they might not have potentially considered previously, things like UV light solutions that can disinfect larger areas at one time. So, just something to consider. And, thirdly, just really think about, what stock and parts you need to have on hand and where you might need some external support to make that happen.
If we go to the next slide. So for those of you that are PartsSource Pro customers, this might look very familiar. This is a snapshot of one of our many forms of analytics. This one is dedicated to a subsegment of the U.S. hospitals that we're tracking for COVID-19 purposes. And it's a great sort of slide to just park on and talk about supply chain for a second, because again, as Mara said, whether you're a partner of ours or not, we would encourage you at this time to take a really active, proactive approach to supplier management right now, and choose folks to work with that are constantly monitoring supply and demand signals for you, and share with them as much data as you can. In my experience, your ability to share data about your operations, your fleet, your historical purchases, your needs, the dynamics in your region right now is gonna multiply tenfold back to you with good advice from high quality partners. Would encourage you to look for folks that have a quality vetting process and can explain it to you in really simple terms, to make sure you're getting the best mix of reliable supply chain participants, reliable parts deliveries, reliable accessories, reliable service at the right price point, and obviously the high quality. We're also seeing people who are calling with questions every day about market options. They are folks that have traditionally bought from OEMs, and they're wondering what else is out there as OEMs get backed up. And there's quite a bit out there. We do an incredible amount of business and have great partnerships with the OEMs. It is the vast majority of our business, but we also study the market and place a huge amount of focus on making sure we find OEM equivalents, secondary parts, refurbished parts, tested parts, and as I mentioned a few minutes ago, alternates to those parts when that is possible. So hopefully you're thinking about all categories when you're looking at your problem and your opportunity, and make sure that you're sort of not just turning over one stone, but you're working with folks that are going to turn over every stone. They're going to scour the planet to find you the options that you wouldn't necessarily find on your own. We're seeing that as we look at our supply base, we've asked them to begin after hours support, weekend support where they didn't have it. Many of them have complied who didn't already have that set up. And we've asked for their creativity as well. Some of those folks don't have the practice, the experience with critical part shipments on weekends, getting things on next flight out. And so we've reached out a hand to help them. And what I tell everybody is there will be stockouts. There will be stockouts. What is important is that you're working with somebody who's going to be constantly on the phone with you about how this supply situation changes day in and day out. We're seeing things that were really tough to get last week that are now available this week, and vice versa. And we expect that to continue. We expect the equipment market, particularly around ventilators, to change dramatically in the next 30 days. But that's true for thermometers. It's true for filters. It's true for test kits. It's true for a lot of things. So our focus is, and I hope your focus is on constant monitoring. And I would encourage you, if you haven't embraced sort of your own CMMS or ERP data, to start looking at consumption patterns, to reach out and maybe we can help you do that. If we want to go to the next slide.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. So yeah, I think that, all of this is really, really important. It's also important to start thinking about the future and how do we prepare for the future. The PartsSource team has been considering that along with all the demand planning we're doing right now, and found this article from a former FDA commissioner to be really relevant to the situation that we find ourselves in, and wanted to share that, with our customers. But I think this is truly an unprecedented time, and no one is really sure what's going to happen from day to day. Similar to the situation that we found ourselves in after 9/11, there's a new normal. And it might be that when things subside and we get through the surge of this pandemic, that we might have, some colleagues that don't come back to the office. There might be new staffing models that we have to put in place, new technology that we have to become accustomed to and integrate into our processes, new ways of working, new ways of responding, both formalized and unformalized. And obviously, there probably will be quite a few new regulations that will happen, whether they're at the hospital level, the state level, the federal level. It's going to be coming. And I think now more than ever, it's really important for us to think both at a global healthcare level and at an organizational level about what our business continuity plans are and how we update those considering the new normal that we're experiencing and will continue to experience. There are sure to be new disinfection standards, probably new admittance policies to hospitals for non-critical workers. And particular to the HTM industry, I think we will have to re-envision and rethink about how we plan for supplies and on-hand inventory, how we look at our warehousing standards, what type of equipment we keep on standby and warehoused and at the ready, because we will think differently about how we contingency plan for other pandemics. And the unfortunate reality is that this will happen again. And having gone through this, now we need to be better prepared than ever for the next time so that we can ensure that we have the most appropriate response plan in place as an HTM industry and within our organization. Something else that we've been when talking with customers about is that we find that there's a lot of work that gets done at the local level. There's many great biomed and HTM local organizations out there at the state level especially, and we would expect to see them become more engaged when sometimes the responses from federal agencies can be slower to come. We expect to see those state agencies and state biomed associations really step up and help guide the way forward. But I think, lastly, I would just leave you with, our thought and the way that we approach business is to be in an ever ready state of supply chain readiness. We would just really encourage you to have proactive conversations with your supplier base, really approach it from a partnership level, start thinking about what you're going to keep within your local stock versus what a supplier can stock for you. PartsSource has really embraced this by considering what we can guarantee stock on for our pro customer base, so that there's never a question of whether we're going to have something that's critical for them. So I would encourage you to consider asking other suppliers to do the same. So with that, we wanted to leave a good chunk of time for questions and answers. So Colleen, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Mara. So to the audience, at this time, you can submit questions using the question section of your control panel. We'll take a few minutes for you guys to enter your questions. We'll also take as much time as we can here today to answer the questions that are coming in. And just to reiterate, if your question isn't answered today, the system will log the question and we will be able to respond to you electronically or via phone. We will have your contact information with which you registered to get back with you guys. So we have some questions coming into the queue here now. See here. The first one we have that I'll tee up to you, Dave and Mara, can you get N95 mask or other PPE?
Sure. So that's a great one, and one we get every day. This is not an area where PartsSource has historically been focused. It's not an area where we're really positioned to support at this time. We've sold them in the past. We've sold a few in the past few weeks, in fact. But really, Owens & Minor, McKesson, Cardinal Health have the whole nation on allocation right now. And I would encourage you to work with your supply chain teams and your distributor reps there to make sure you've got your place in line. I'd also encourage you to work locally. I know that we're hearing an outpouring of people across the U.S. working with local community groups, church groups, everything, sewing circles that are producing sort of goods every day. And I would follow this one closely because, as you know, that there have been many folks who have stepped up, who produce clothing on a regular basis, who are producing these. So I would really get the word out in your local community and make sure you're doing that while the larger producers on a global basis ramp supply. I expect that will change in the next 30 days, but in the next 30 days, it's really the big Owens Minor, McKesson, Cardinal Health, or your local community that I would point you to. It's a great question.
Okay, the next one I see, if the OEM is telling me a part is not available, would you have another source that sells an OEM product, the OEM product?
Sure, I can take that one, Colleen. Yes, I think it's it's definitely worth reaching out to us. We have, PartsSource has developed supplier relationships outside of, obviously we work directly with all the major OEMs, but we also have developed supplier relationships outside of those OEM direct channels. And we do this in order to offer our customers as many alternative options as we can that are quality options. And in the case that an OEM, new part is stocked out, we definitely do have options of alternative condition parts for many of the parts that we offer in our catalog. We have replacement OEM or new aftermarket parts. We also stock and carry refurbished and tested parts. And all of that is underpinned by a quality ranking module. So we really only use suppliers that we've vetted for quality and that meet the quality standards that meet our ISO certifications. So anything that we sell as new aftermarket meets the OEM equivalent of form, fit, and function. So while we won't have OEM alternatives on every single part, we do have them on many, and it's definitely worth going online, logging into the catalog, and or reaching out to your account management or customer care team.
Thanks, Mara. The next one, are your vendors at risk? Should I be concerned?
I'll take that one. The short answer is no, you should not be concerned. We work day in and day out with hundreds and hundreds of vendors and suppliers. We're constantly monitoring their supply levels. And I can say that 99% of what you need, those goods are flowing. There are a few problem areas that I don't have to explain to anybody around ventilation, specifically around the servo eyes and the Puritan Bennett 840s. Those are tough. Thermometers are tough. But we monitor this stuff, as I said, on a daily basis, and are tracking all lead times and back orders. We place orders ahead of schedule so that we can get our place in line. We reach out to the top leadership at each of these suppliers to make sure we understand exactly where they stand and what we need. And again, 99% of the folks that we're talking to and the SKUs we're looking at are not seeing disruption right now. There are slightly delayed answers, meaning it takes time to get people to return certain information, confirmation, tracking numbers, things like that. But the system is all working and working well, frankly. Great question.
Okay, and the next one, if I need Infusion monitoring equipment, what options do you have?
Yeah, I can I can take this one. This is a good question and one we're getting a lot right now. We've gotten multiple requests for this type of equipment. Over the past year, PartsSource has expanded our, we call it minor equipment portfolio. Currently, there's over 2,000 devices in the catalog, and that includes infusion and monitoring equipment, as well as teletransmitters, modules, defibrillators, scales, pulse oximeters, etc., and typically thermometers. Although we're not, you know, as Dave mentioned, not in a place right now to provide those at the moment. But all of that minor equipment is viewable on our catalog on our website. Obviously, availability is fluctuating daily, and so we encourage you to reach out to our customer care team, to your sales rep, to your account manager for the latest information, and let us know specifically what model of equipment, what version you're looking for, and any details that we might need to be able to go out there and source that for you. We still are finding pockets of infusion and monitoring equipment available, and are working every day to get those in the hands of our customers. So.
I would just maybe add to that, Mara, that, you know, as you think about your equipment needs, think holistically about what you're going to need over the next few months in terms of PM kits and repair and the accessories that go with it. We're seeing incredible demand for cables of all sorts, invasive blood pressure, SpO2, trunk cables, lead wires, batteries, the PM kits associated with these. So you know, think holistically about what you're going to need above and beyond the actual equipment that you're bulking up on now.
Yes, good point.
There's another question that plays into kind of your response that came through. Is your website up to date with displaying availability of parts?
Yeah, I can take that. It is definitely as up to date as it can be. Things are changing minute to minute and day to day. And the moment that we know that something goes on back order or isn't available, we do update that in our catalog. But obviously there's a lot of fluidity right now in the space of parts, service, and equipment purchases. So we are keeping it as up to date as we can. And if there's any questions about availability, again, encourage you to reach out to your PartsSource team, and they will jump on whatever your need is and determine what the availability of that is.
Yeah, the teams are available around the clock. So as Mara said, just if you have a doubt, reach out.
Thanks. The next one, this was, I think, referring to one of the slides you had up earlier. Will you supply this list to us, the list of most common repair parts orders? Might have been that slide you were talking to, Mara.
Yes, we are going to supply that to everyone who was on the webinar today. We will be sending out the critical modality guide and the ventilator suggested quantity on hand parts. That will go out either later this afternoon or this evening to everyone on the call.
Thanks. Next, is any delaying device PMs to include ease device availability? Reading that verbatim. Delaying device PMs.
I think it might be referring to whether anyone is delaying their PMs in order to create more device availability at this time. Yeah, I can speak to a little bit of that. We have been hearing from customers that if they aren't, you know, there's been no specific CMS guidance yet on delaying PMs released. And so Joint Commission and other regulatory bodies have not, they have stopped doing routine inspections at this point. They have also not released any guidance because their guidance is based on CMS guidance, obviously. So I think most of our customers and healthcare organizations we're working with are putting plans together and contingency plans together to you know, delegate that PM work to be less important than the other critical work that they need to do to keep equipment up and running. And if they haven't already started delaying PMs, they have a contingency plan in place to be able to do so once they feel it's necessary. Dave, would you add anything to that?
Yeah, no, I think you nailed it. I think exactly. People are taking a cautious approach, but they're absolutely prioritizing and shifting PMs out.
Right.
We have a couple more I'd like to, hopefully we can get to here in the next few minutes before the top of the hour. This one's kind of lengthy, so I'll read it verbatim. We are reading news of stockpiled ventilators arriving inoperative in states that have received these. Do you know how we should be prepared for additional work, availability of parts for these models that may be new to our hospitals?
Yeah, that's a great one. I can take it, and Mara, let me know if you have any comments. But I've seen this phenomenon. We've been hearing about it as well. As people start to look under every rock for equipment, what we're seeing is stuff that's coming out in a tested variety, or sometimes a less than tested variety, as many of the refurbished and certified equipment has been taken already. So what we've been doing is we've been making sure that we're doing two things. One is communicating folks to have an intentional and thoughtful approach to depot repair, and have a triage sort of point as they onboard this equipment, to make sure some of that's going right out to a depot, as well as making sure that they are, as I mentioned earlier, not just buying equipment, but buying holistically for the life cycle of that equipment over the next year. So the PM kits that should come with, the filters, the accessories, the parts. We have a full stock of infusion, patient monitoring, and ventilator parts, so we're happy to help. But really not an advertisement for us. It's more about making sure you're planning for what you need ahead of time. This ties back to the modality guide that Mara talked to. So as we send that out, you'll get at least the top handful of most popular parts per ventilator for whoever asked that question, and that should be your starting point.
Another one came in as you were responding. Has anyone received regulatory forgiveness or leniency for PMs from CMS? So I don't know, Mara or Dave, if you've heard of any of our customers that have
officially or unofficially,
that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's been any official guidance issued yet, as I mentioned earlier. So if anyone has received any official guidance, certainly reach out and let us know, and we can distribute that accordingly. But to our knowledge, that has not happened.
Yeah, I would just say that, we talk to leading hospitals every day and leading thinkers in the space every day. And I think what I would encourage you to do is to gather your stakeholders and take a really thoughtful, risk-based, pragmatic approach, and know that your peers are doing the same thing, and that we are seeing people decide to take that risk because the what you can do with your staff and the lives you can save is that much more important. So while no one is officially saying that they have regulatory sort of okay or approval yet, I think what you're seeing is hospitals making those decisions on their own in a very thoughtful way.
Next, who do we contact if we would like help with our analytics and how our hospitals should prepare?
Sure. Good question. I guess I would offer to reach out to myself, and I can certainly help to give some guidance and some support in that area with my team. We will publish my contact information as part of the follow-up, but anyone is welcome to email or call me at any time with assistance around analytics, and I will figure out what the right resource is to connect you with.
And of course, I would say you can also call our customer care team at any time. The phone number is on our website at PartsSource.com, and they'll connect you with us. They'll connect you with Mara or Mara's team, who are great at digging into these kinds of problems.
Yes, and it's a good point, Dave, because many of our customer care teams, our frontline teams, have access, to your data for what you've purchased through us specifically, and they can help access that easily for you if it's a greater project with your complete purchasing history. Then reaching out to me and my team would be the right approach.
So I believe we've answered most of the questions in the queue. We've got another moment. Let's see if anything else is here. If anybody has additional questions, as Mara and Dave have shared, feel free to contact us by the 800 number there on the screen. When you receive your follow-up information, we'll also have contact information listed there as well. So at this time, I would like to thank Mara and Dave and all of you who joined for the webinar. Thank you all for spending your time with us today. As a reminder, you're going to receive a follow-up email that includes a link to the presentation recording. We're hoping to get that out tonight or tomorrow at the latest, sooner than we normally would, so we can get this information in your hands. We will include the guide that Mara referenced to as well. At this time, the webcast has ended. Thank you again for attending, and we hope you have a wonderful day.
Thanks all.